Good evening and welcome to our program this evening. My name is Gavin Cleespies and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm very happy to welcome everyone to the program we're having this evening. Our program this evening will look at the folk music revival that sprung up in the clubs and coffee houses of Cambridge and Boston in the early 1960s. This movement brought together many people who went on to larger national fame and helped to inspire the civil rights movement, peace activists, and the back to land movements. However, as it gained more national attention, the movement changed and largely left New England. Our speaker this evening is Tom Curren, who is now the volunteer board chair of Folk New England. As a high school student, he became devoted to the music of the Boston Cambridge Folk Revival, attending dozens of performances at coffee houses, concerts, and festivals. He later moved north up to New Hampshire, where he had a career in the nonprofit world. He recently retired, most recently after 8 years as a project director for the Pew Charitable Trusts, where he administered a challenge grant program that resulted in funding protection for more than 800,000 acres of land throughout the Northeast. He is a farmer, historian, and consultant, and continues to live in New Hampshire. Before we begin this program, I'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time. If you're not familiar with MHS, we are the oldest historical society in America and have been collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our history since 1791. We hold an amazing collection of close to 14 million manuscript pages, including the papers of US presidents, soldiers, mothers, scientists, pioneers, and protesters. Because of the support of our donors, we can offer programs such as this evening's for free, and we keep our library open to the public. We hope you'll return for future events or to do research in our library. And if you enjoy our programs, we hope you'll consider supporting our work by making a donation or becoming a member. Now, without further ado, Tom, if you'd like to join me, we can get this conversation started. How is life in New Hampshire?
It's colder today than it was yesterday, but it's wonderful.
That's great. So do you want to give us a little bit of a background on this folk music book that you put together? Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the folk music scene, what drew you to it, and what kept you involved over the years?
Well, thank you. And I'd like to start by thanking you, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and everybody who's joining us this afternoon. We'll call this less than a month of a solar drawdown ahead to the winter solstice. So the subject at hand is the culture of regional folk music in New England. But I started in the late 1500s and then concentrate on the 10 years before 1968. I grew up in the town of Melrose, and from an early age, I was drawn to history and to music. I lived a short bike ride away from the old Scotch Boardman and the Upham houses, the Saugus Ironworks, Old Ironsides, the New Bedford Whaling Museum, Sturbridge Village, and historic Deerfield were all places my parents took me to see, and as a boy, I fell under their collective spells. My first venture in creative writing, this is not my first rodeo, occurred in 1956, resulting in an early morning special delivery letter sent from radio station WBZ on Soldiers Field Road that informed me that I'd won second prize in an essay contest on the theme, What the Flag Means to Me. My prize was a long-playing Decca record album by Fred Waring and his Pennsylvanians called The Song of America. The piece was made up of a collection of readings and poetry set to music that told the American story from the voyage of Columbus to the Union victory in the Civil War. That old recording was stirring, inspirational, and is still unforgettable. Later that year, while sitting in the family car in Gloucester and waiting for the open Blyman drawbridge to be set back down, I heard a car radio blaring the Everly Brothers' first hit, Bye Bye Love, and I never forgot that either. Sometime in early 1963, I became aware that there was a folk music revival going on in Boston and Cambridge. 14 is quite an inquisitive age, and I made it my business to listen on radio, watch on television, and to read as much about this phenomenon as I could. I discovered that for 55 cents, I could catch the 7:05 train in Melrose and take it to Boston. And after a jaunt up over the north slope and then down the west flank of Beacon Hill, I could find myself sitting in any of the three small coffee houses located on Charles Street and listening to folk musicians perform old blues ballads and songs. After a few hours, I had to run back up Beacon Hill and over to the North Station where I could catch the 11:05, the last train back to Melrose. I made this pilgrimage frequently for nearly 3 years, at least a day a week, a night a week, adding Saturday trips to the Club 47 after it moved from Mount Auburn to Palmer Street in Cambridge. In 1968, I went to New Hampshire to work on Senator Eugene McCarthy's presidential campaign, and here I've pretty much lived ever since. In the early 2000s, I found myself working for the Pew Charitable Trust, driving about 50,000 miles a year to help fund conservation initiatives throughout the Northeast. About the same time, I found that my local dump keeper had a fervent interest in music, coupled with a fantastic collection of turntables and other gizmos that can convert my folk music record albums into compact discs. Every town should have a bohemian dump keeper, and many do. I was soon spending much of my time in a motorized Toyota sound booth, traversing the highways and byways between Philadelphia and time, field hollers and Seashanties back to me. Sometime in 2015, I decided to write a book, and here we are. Robert Frost is supposed to have said that what he tried to do was to write a few poems that would be hard to get rid of. And I think that's what folk music and folk culture are about, especially here in New England. Shared memories of place that are hard for us to get rid of. Even though folklore celebrates things that can seem irrelevant, outdated, and obscure, some sort of visceral urge insists upon bringing us back to a place where, if we're paying attention, we can still get a glimpse of the true nature of the human species. When that happens to us, it's often not a minute too soon. And that's what I want to speak with you about tonight.
Well, so we have a number of questions to ask, and I just thought we
Sure.
could start going through some of that. Could we start out just by you sort of setting the scene a little bit? I mean, what does Cambridge and Boston look like? What was Harvard Square like when you first got there?
Well, the late 50s, early 60s, it was, Gavin, you and I have talked about this. Boston was really, had kind of gone to seed from the city on the hill. It was losing, Boston and Cambridge were losing population. There was still a great deal of sort of institutional integrity, but at the same time, it was not the center of national matters, certainly after John Kennedy's assassination. And it was a bit of a depressed area, I think, culturally. Um, it was not as clean as it is now. A lot of old buildings are being torn down instead of restored. So it was not the hub of the universe that it had been, and that we think of it today.
Yeah, I mean, having grown up in the area, I can say that I think that looking at Boston and Cambridge today, it's hard to imagine what they looked like a while ago. But the populations of both Boston and Cambridge and Somerville and the sort of surrounding communities peaked in about 1950, and then went into a pretty steady decline. So Boston and Cambridge
Yeah.
both lost about 30% of their population between 1950 and 1980. So it was a period of tremendous exodus, not a period of expanse.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And other than the Celtics, nobody won anything ever.
Well, there was the '67 Red Sox, which was
That's right. Oh yeah.
possible dream team,
Oh,
but it didn't actually materialize. It
they
only
got
went so
close. I was there for the 6th and 7th games.
yeah. So
Yeah, and the other thing I think progressives now might not understand, maybe certainly wouldn't have experienced, is the there were no women in the state house. There were no African Americans in the state house. Um, you could go to jail for selling birth control. It was a different deal.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it was both Cambridge and Boston were old industrial cities that had very strong working class populations, and some of the more conservative mores that you would assume with that. Um, and then there was this folk music explosion, and that was very different.
Very different. And to give everybody their due, the working class ethnic
So we might be losing you a little bit here, Tom. We might really be losing you here, Tom. Well, let's see. I'm not sure if Tom can hear us. Olivia, perhaps you could send Tom an email, just to let him know that he's a little bit frozen.
small ways.
Oh,
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. It's like a cell phone conversation. You're not sure what was missed. The folk revival was spontaneous and it wasn't planned, and it happened. Basically, I think the start of it were students coming both to BU and to Harvard or MIT also, and it kind of was homegrown and sort of individually based, and it's centered around the two squares, Kenmore Square and Harvard Square.
great. So just so you're aware, Tom, we're having a little bit of connectivity issues here. So you're dropping off
Okay.
a little bit intermittently, but it seems that you're on now, so that's good. So
Okay.
what were some of the great sites where this started? I mean, everyone has probably heard of Club 47, but that was certainly not the only place. You want to tell us a little bit about where the sort of epicenters of this revival were?
Sure. In Kenmore Square, there's a place called Cafe Yana, and later a club called the Golden Vanity. Neither are there anymore. So those were early spots. Charles Street was the Turk's Head and the Orleans, and then of course Cambridge was Tula's coffee house, and then Club 47 on Mount Auburn Street. So those were the places where people, many of them were already doing jazz and doing a bit of like art shows, art displays, but but they were commandeered by a couple of people like Eric von Schmidt, the Charles River Valley Boys, who started doing folk music there, and then it just took off.
All right. So can you tell us a little bit about who are the people who are sort of most important to moving this along? Obviously, we know some of the names that you just mentioned, but I'm wondering, who else? What were the people who helped sort of push this forward?
Sure, I would say probably the earliest ones were people like Eric von Schmidt, who was an artist and a blues singer, lived on at. I could hear you.
Okay, and we can hear you now.
Okay, so we'll start with Eric von Schmidt,
Mhm.
and I think also a guy named Paul Clayton, who was a folklorist and a musician, good, from New Bedford, and a guy named Ralph Kahn, who was a very interesting character, musician, who had been a commando during World War II, and then came to America and took up folk music in Cambridge and later in California. So those were probably the early provocateurs, I guess you could say, who started insinuating themselves into the coffee houses and maybe pushing the jazz guys and the flamenco singers aside and introducing blues ballads and songs. And then spontaneously, I think the Charles River Valley Boys would have been next. And then everybody just dove in. It was a point where people felt pretty uninhibited about getting on stage and learning to play the guitar, and that sort of some floodgates opened. And obviously, the person we probably remember the most was Joan Baez, who had a huge influence on everybody. She just was so talented and soaked up a lot of influences quickly, and actually, you could say, turbocharged the scene in Kenmore Square and in Cambridge.
Great, great. So, do you have any sense of why this happened when it happened?
Yeah, we may still be.
We can hear. I can hear
Huh.
you fine, Tom. Um,
Well, that's a good question. Okay. I mean, you can point to a lot of sort of maybe some of the more, one could say, even boring aspects of a very conformist era in the 1950s that got people wanting to find something different. What actually caused it is really hard to say. I think because it started in 58, 59, there was already a movement nationally around pop folk groups like the Kingston Trio, people like Harry Belafonte, but there was a desire on the part, particularly of young academics, to dig deeper and try to go to the original sources and learn more about the origins of folk music, and actually to become practitioners, which in retrospect is kind of remarkable, but it also and it was really disorganized. It was not and there were no websites or how-tos, but it also was, to use a word we're using, it was highly contagious. It was something that people, when you saw somebody doing it, playing a banjo, playing a guitar, singing, you really wanted to do it yourself. And it became very much something that people did on their own, and it spread really quickly.
Great. So that would sort of lead me to another question about whether, like, the proximity of universities made Boston and Cambridge the place for this to start, because certainly they weren't the largest music scenes in the country. But was it, because you had Harvard and BU and Northeastern, that's why this was the epicenter of this?
I think it was, and very much BU, as you say, BU, Harvard, and MIT. And also, we in New England, whether we knew it or not all the time or aware of it, there was a lot of basic scholarship about folk music that had started in the 1890s with Francis James Child and the various women folklorists who were active in the teens and 20s, collecting folk music in Cambridge and Lynn and Wiscasset, Maine. So there was something in the air. There's something in there's a preservation impulse. You trace yourselves back to 1791, and I think that has something to do with it. That people, it was a place where history was respected, and so it wasn't impossible to be sort of cutting edge and historically rooted at the same time, and that combination was pretty dynamic.
Great. So I know that having grown up in Cambridge, in the Cambridge Boston area, often people look back on these days and they remember them very much with rose-colored glasses. These were sort of halcyon days. Was that your experience, or was it more complicated than that?
It was more complicated than that. If you stood out, it was the atmosphere was very conformist, socially. And if you stood out in any way, you were a weirdo, or there were other names that you could throw at ethnic groups, and so you had to be careful. I think it was for an area that was steeped in freedom and liberty and had so much of a heritage in that direction. There was a fair amount of fear, and you did have to watch your step in culturally. And if you stood out, as ultimately many people did who were in this kind of a movement, although long hair in 1963 and 64 would look would come to look pretty short. But it took some courage, I think, on the part of young men and especially young women, and also people of color at that point, to go outside of the beaten path socially and stand out, because if you stood out, you were going to draw fire, and you had to be ready for that.
Right. This was, of course, also the
If
period
if the Boston press ever paid much attention. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say this was also, of course, the period of the Vietnam War and the draft, and I imagine that would have, to some degree, influenced people's experiences.
It crept in. It was interesting because early on, 59, 60, 61, 62, there were definitely people who, well, I mean, the prevailing issue was civil rights, particularly civil rights in the South. But the peace issue, there were definitely people who were, I think of songs that Bonnie Dobson wrote, songs that Dale Stanley wrote, songs that Bob Dylan wrote, that were basically saying we're drifting into a war at some point. But then, it was kind of like boiling a lobster slowly. That all didn't heat up until 64, 65. So it was the war and the fact that people could get drafted, would get drafted. And then, I knew kids who didn't go to college, and I had a lot of friends who went to Vietnam, and some of them who didn't survive that. And so that was something that grew over time, Gavin, and hit a crescendo.
So Cambridge and Boston were relatively small towns, but the folk music revival that started here went on to have a big impact on the country. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the impact of this folk music revival was on a national level?
Well, as things were, moving along, New York, of course, it was interesting. New York was concentrated in the Village, with the satellite up at Saratoga Springs at Cafe Lena's. In New England, we had coffee houses kind of all over I'm going to say 5 of the 6 states, and I list them in the appendix. And plus the fact that the people coming here as students were going back to all over the country in the summertime. So that the spread of this, was kind of a natural thing. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's kind of hard to grasp now is how difficult it was to get a record out. But if a record didn't get out, it would get lots of play nationally. And that's where sort of the more famous, the Joan Baez impact, the Bob Dylan impact, some of the other, Buffy St. Marie's, Taj Mahal, some of the folks we had here. One of the more fascinating groups was Jim Kweskin and the Jug Band, who started, in Cambridge, and developed a pretty dynamic repertoire, and also an interesting image of kind of retro hipness that was very influential all across the country, and particularly in San Francisco. We have in the Folk New England collection actual posters from the Avalon Ballroom and Winterland in Haight-Ashbury of Jim Kweskin and the Jug Band opening for the Doors, or the Big Brother and the Holding Company opening for Jim Kweskin and the Jug Band. Those Janis Joplin in particular was a fan of theirs. The Grateful Dead formed the night after their membership, who were just a bunch of friends, had gone to a Jim Kweskin and the Jug Band concert. And, that group of musicians, Jim himself, who was a fantastic guitar player, fantastic singer, Jeff Moldauer, nobody sings like Jeff Moldauer. He's an amazing guy, amazing source. Maria Moldauer, his wife, Fritz Richmond on washtub bass. There was nobody like Fritz. Bill Keith on banjo, and other members who came and went. That was a very dynamic and very influential group. And so what happened later, in terms of particularly not just the music and the connection to ragtime and jazz, but also the attitude, the dress, the threads, what they wore, that was the beginning, I think, heavily influential in San Francisco.
And I have to say that the most personal experience I've ever had with Jim Kweskin was that he performed at Betsy Siggins' 70th birthday party, which I attended, and then was just sort of hanging out and wandering around talking to people. It was a very personable guy. So.
He really is. He is one of the easiest people I know to speak to. Watching him play the guitar is incredible, and I would urge anybody to pick up the records he's making now. He has one called Jim Kweskin in the 21st Century. And I also, just in that group right now, Jeff Moldauer, as I mentioned, is just finished. I've had the privilege of listening to some of the new music he's made, and that'll be coming out in the spring. Those guys are still at it, and they all still have their fastball.
So I have just a couple more questions, and then I think that we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so we can get to some of those. And I would just let the audience know that they can use the Q&A function, and we will get to as many questions as we can. So can you tell us a little bit about how this book project came about? It seems like it became a real sort of labor of love for you, even if it wasn't your first writing project.
Well, that was a labor of love too, a short one. Well, Gavin, you're part of the story. When you were at the Cambridge Historical Society, you worked with Betsy Siggins, the aforementioned Betsy Siggins, who managed the Club 47, and she started to put a collection of recordings, memorabilia, photographs together. That the first collection place was refuge for all of that was the Cambridge Historical Society. Later on, Betsy founded a nonprofit called Folk New England, and through my wife, she asked if I'd be interested in giving them some advice, and I said, sure, I'll write you up a strategic plan. And I did. And then I thought, I talked to Betsy, I saw things through in kind of the nonprofit management kind of a way. And then I decided that the best person to lead this is going to be Jim Rooney. Jim's smart. He knows everybody. He's already written a book about the subject, Baby Let Me Follow You Down. So I went up to Vermont and I put the arm on him. I said, we're working, trying to get this nonprofit going, and Jim ended up very really interested, and he's a true believer. And then he walked me out to the car, and typically when you're making an ask in the nonprofit world, that often the ask comes to fruition at when you're getting in the driveway, when you're ready to go. And Jim, I'm not sure physically, but he sort of put his arm on my shoulder and said, "Tom, I believe God sent you to be the chair of the board of Folk New England." And so I was kind of, flipped. So I capitulated, and we worked on the collection. We got it going at UMass, and then having this incredible group of recordings that I had to catalog and listen to, and then also the ones that I was listening to in the car, in the truck while I was driving for Pew. I started thinking, there's nobody's ever, well, other than Baby Let Me Follow You Down, there's a bigger story here. There's a story about the history of New England folk music and how all of folk music in the country started really, right here. And that story hasn't been told. And also the story of the folk revival kind of at the street level, not just at the Club 47, but elsewhere in Boston and Cambridge and, places like Orono, Maine and Amherst, Massachusetts, and Ipswich, the King's Rook, and out on Martha's Vineyard, at the Mooncusser. So that I got rolling. And fortunately, I had my wife Kathy agreed to edit this, so it's more coherent than it might otherwise have been. So I just decided to do it, and ultimately, got it early in 2019. It got in the publishing queue at UMass Press.
Great. So, one last question that I have, and then we can turn to audience questions. So the folk music revival sort of dissipates about 10 years after it starts. Do you have any sense of, I mean, at this point now, Passim's is still around and has been there as a stalwart for many years.
Yeah.
But the rest of the clubs are generally gone. So do you have a sense of why that happened, about why it just sort of it went away in the same way that it sort of appeared kind of all at once?
Well, a combination, I think, of culture, to some degree, politics and economics. I mean, you got into those places for like 35 cents. And I think the cover at the Club 47 was at the most a buck and a half. But when, some of the bigger bands, particularly the blues bands, Muddy Waters, Paul Butterfield, when that all started to expand, you had bigger clubs who were not nonprofits. The Boston Tea Party, there were a bunch of them, and those places were paying these bands thousands and thousands of dollars to come, and the cover were $5 to $10. The coffee houses couldn't compete. The Club 47 actually went in debt tens of thousands of dollars. It only seated, I think what's now Club Passim. It's not a big room. So some of it was economics. It got so popular that you had to have a bigger hall, and the prices got high. So that was an issue. Also, just culturally, someone with an acoustic guitar wasn't cutting edge anymore. And we had an explosion of rock and roll music, and figures as disparate as the Beatles and the Stones and Bob Dylan, and then moving up into Bruce Springsteen, and other people who took the culture in a different direction. But you had to go to a theater or maybe even an amphitheater to see them. So that whole coffee house thing just economically didn't work. And I think the other issue to some degree is politics. I think, the fervor, the unity around civil rights, it didn't it didn't survive. Things splintered up, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I try to mention some of them in the book, but the movement started to lose altitude. And I have to say, when the draft was not that big an issue anymore, some of the fervor in the anti-war movement dissipated. So it became a much more of a Entertainment situation in some ways, music, and the venues got enormous. I mean, 700,000 people in upstate New York. There were some people who were pretty skilled at keeping, not only keeping the faith, but sort of capitalizing on it. Um, Tom Rush is certainly one of them locally, but then you had a couple of people who cut their teeth in the local coffee houses. James Taylor on the Vineyard, Bonnie Raitt on Charles Street, who caught the tail end of this and then took it out further in a different situation. And ironically, and I think liberatingly, all of a sudden, singer-songwriters came to the fore in the folk movement in the 70s and 80s, a book somebody else should write. And women, instead of being relegated to a second and a half class citizenship, women became the movers and shakers, the sort of Cheryl Wheelers, the the Indigo Girls, Tracy Chapman. I mean, that the women came to the fore in what was left of the folk music revival, but that was a different deal. So it just morphed, it changed. Meanwhile, the Newport Folk Festival, which had been struggling, suddenly caught wind and caught a tailwind, and now I guess you have to order tickets months and months ahead, or you're out of luck, and you have to buy, a big block of tickets to get in. So it's interesting the way it's shifted over time. What's different is fewer people are doing their own music, and they're doing it in larger groups instead of small gatherings. But that this is it's just a continuing process. It keeps turning over.
Great. Well, we have we have a bunch of questions from the audience, so we can
Sure.
get to some of them. One, which is just a straight factual question, which is a person asked, what were the places on Charles Street that you mentioned called? What were the names of the locations on Charles Street?
On the State House side, I guess that's the east. There was on close to Beacon Street. There was a place called the Orleans that was founded, I think, in '55, and it later, maybe a block and a half in from Beacon, and that later became the Sword and the Stone. Um, that place was noteworthy because it had a piano. So then further down, maybe halfway towards Cambridge Street, on the same side of the street was a place called the Turk's Head, which was magic. It was a great place, very small room, about the size of a subway car. It was a great place to see music. It's a French restaurant now, or it was a couple of years ago. Across the street from the Turk's Head, that is on the Charles River side, there was a second story venue called the Loft, and they brought in sort of more nationally known performers. Mimi and Richard Farina played their longest residence there. I think they were there a whole week once. So there were three right there on the street.
So an anonymous person said, where does the history of sea shanties fit into this story?
Oh, um, it gets there early and it never leaves. That was one of the spontaneous work songs. Those were Anglo work songs, and that was part of a tradition that was going on in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. I don't know that it wasn't going on in Germany and Holland and Spain, but you were at a work song when you had to haul up an anchor or haul down the sails, and that came over here, and that was a singing in unison. It was stirring. It was you could do hard work, dangerous work to those tunes, and that just it hit its stride, and I think probably was really dominant right through the clipper ship era, which would have been up until about the Civil War. And there were people who never wanted to give that up, and so you got people who always kept that tradition alive. And in places like Mystic Seaport, Westport Point, Machias, Maine, and I know recently viral on the internet. There are people who are, that's stirring stuff. So I'd say that's an important thread. That and contra dance, and the blues are three of the most hardiest perennials.
All right, great. So we also had a question. It said, what, if any, did the Weavers play in the Boston Cambridge folk music scene?
They would have been the Weavers were after World War II and up until they were blacklisted, and but they were until that happened. Let's say 49, 50, 51. They were doing. Again, sanitized. They were all in suits and dresses and ties, but they were singing progressive songs, old folk songs, songs of liberal political causes,
Mhm.
and those would have been the people, academics who were a little more than a little older than I am, maybe people who were born in the 30s, um, would flock to see them when they came to Boston. Pete Seeger was part of that group. Lee Hayes, Ronnie Gilbert, Fred Hellerman. So they would have been pre Kingston Trio
Mhm.
and very liberal and very, very identified with liberal causes. So they were huge. I mean, you often, having cleaned out a few houses of donated recordings, you'll often find a lot of Weavers records.
Mhm. Great. So we also had a question, what were some of the common themes in the lyrics of folk music during this period, if there were any common themes?
Yeah, I think some of that followed form. Um, there were obviously the love songs. I mean, particularly the child ballads, the lyric songs, Barbara Allen, often tragic love or just romantic love. There were work songs, and mostly the Seashanties were a work song, but for most people, they would think of that most the big encounter with work songs was African American work songs, people who worked with a rhythm. And then you had idioms, the bluegrass. Bluegrass was imported into Cambridge very early, and a certain percentage of people had to learn to play the banjo or the fiddle. Um, you know the themes are so rich. I mean, crimes, historical events, again, romance, politics. Those there were the whole gamut. It's kind of an almanac of themes, but exile, exile being a big one. Irish exile, Scottish exile, African exile. That's you can add the exile. Buffy St. Marie's, now that the buffalo's gone, the exile of the Native Americans. That's just home, missing home, not knowing what home is, wanting a sense of home. I can feel chills as I'm saying that, because that's that's a huge theme right there, and for a country like America, it makes a certain amount of sense that we would all feel that we want to cure a sense of displacement, or heal, maybe it might be a better word.
Well, Cindy asked, the bluegrass scene seems to be very vibrant here now. Is this a child of the folk revival, or is it perhaps something else?
Well, Gavin, I would think it is, because in my experience, it was the Charles River Valley Boys, and the interesting thing about them is, or among the interesting things, they were from all over the country. Two of their members met. One from Bob Siggins was a Nebraska kid who got on the train to go to Harvard his freshman year, late August. probably to 57, maybe 8. And in Texas, the train goes through Texas, and Clay Jackson gets on, and Clay's a singer and a guitar player. And they didn't get to the Mississippi River before in the train before they realized, hey, we can sing. They get to Harvard. Eric Satcom is there, and he wants to start he wants to start a bluegrass group, and so ultimately, Keith and Rooney get involved. Bill Keith and Jim Rooney were Amherst students. They bring in Joe Val. They 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 want to sing with somebody who can break glass, and Joe Val is high tenor. He can do that, and he's also an amazing mandolin player, and he's been playing in Watertown. Folk New England has snapshots of Joe Val playing at parties in Watertown in the late 40s. So there was an amazing, and when you hear bluegrass, it's hard to sit still. It's you want to sing along. It's very energetic music. So I think that thread has never been broken, and that I don't think that ever disappeared. And I think that's one of the things we're good at here in New England. My younger brother Mike is probably could fill you in more on that scene down here over the last 20 or 30 years, but all I know is he's kept me posted with it. He keeps sending me evidence that bluegrass is alive and well in New England.
So Lon asked, how does Rounder Records fit into the story? And Rounder Records, one of the founders, is also a prolific writer on the Red Sox. So we've hosted him for a number of programs.
He's really good at that. I've got his book on Pumpsy Green. Rounder Records was a labor of love to sort of pick up where maybe folkways in New York might have left off, and a little bit more. And this is my interpretation of it. Savvy and hip a bit, but at the same time connected to really elevating and bringing to life some of the more obscure but really important folk music idioms and performers, and so those guys, they were tireless. They like folkways. Their catalog got enormous, and so they preserved an awful lot of things. There are record. The Blue Sky Boys was one of my favorites. A concert at the college campus in 1964 that starts with "Are you from Dixie?" Well, I'm from Dixie too. And that's stuff that's not available in the stores usually, but those guys harmonize so well. And then you had things like they would dig up field recordings of civil rights songs on site, at sit-ins where people were getting beat up, and put those records out on Rounder Records. That was an enormous cultural favor to humanity that those folks did for the whole folk music idiom. And for the Red Sox too.
So Rose asked, and this is, I think, something that you probably don't know exactly, but just if you have a range, what dates were Robert J. Lertzma's late night folk music program on the radio?
Well, I can tell you, he was an amazing character. He started showing up, I think, at some of the hootenannies as early as '63. And then I think he got on the radio late '63, certainly '63, 4, 5, and 6. I believe it was CRB. And, he was a unique voice. He was a unique persona. But the thing about that show that I don't think was by accident, he would, let's just pick somebody, Tom Rush or Jack Landrone, Jackie Washington. he'd arranged to say, hey, you're doing a concert at Jordan Hall. Why don't you get in a cab and come up to the studio right afterwards? Well, those on a good night, and Tom Rush and Jackie Washington mostly had good nights. They leave the stage and they'd still be, like ready to go. This was a big deal. They not only performed well, but they had an audience just go wild over them. So they go back up into Lertzerman's studio with that kind of energy still, and they want to keep playing. And Lertzmer would sort of put this cultivated frame around their songs and introduce them. And I I was 14 at that point. Staying up as all night. That stuff was just magic, and I don't know of any recordings of it now. Um, but he was the same Robert J. that we morning pro musica'd our way with for years, but just in that different idiom. Yeah, it was interesting. He also was more of a natty dresser. He often Lurtzen would show up at an event with a tie on. So that was different.
So Eva asked, would you say that folk music is still popular in some places? And if so, who's performing now?
It is popular, and I think there's a broader range of people performing now because it's so easier to make a record or make a CD or or get on YouTube. You couldn't do that in those days. You had to get a company interested in investing in you then, and put out a record that you had to probably go to a studio to make. Um, you know, my my I date myself every time I open my mouth. I'm mostly concentrating on the people who are still performing from that era, and I would say people like Jeff Muldaur, Tom Rush, whose websites you can go on and find out where they are. Maria Muldaur still performs from time to time. The newer performers, I think, nationally, and when I say new, this is already I'm dating myself because some of these folks are 10 or 15 years old, but younger performers like let's say the Old Crow Medicine Show, which is basically a string band group, um, and uh, and then you still got blues players, you still got people who play in the folk idioms. There are folk shows on. Um, I know in Boston radio that you could tune into and get a much more up to date picture than I'm able to give. But it's still going on, and it's probably easier to gig now than it was then, just because and to sell a few CDs because you can make them yourself and you couldn't back then.
So a person asked if you could talk a little bit about Hillbilly at Harvard and what that sort of just a little bit about what that was.
That was one of the early radio shows that I'm going to guess, 59 maybe, that came on, and it was very much freeform student radio. Sometimes you'd get Tom Rush was the MC for a while, and he was MCing it before he did any public playing, at least. And he would bring people in like Mitch Greenhill, and they would sing together and talk a lot. They would talk about the music, talk about who their favorite. Um, it's very much an in thing to have a collection of 78s and to know who and to be able to drop some names. Sleepy John Estes or Gid Tanner and his Skillet Lickers or other groups that and that's what they talk about. And of course, if you were like my age and you said who get who, and you'd run out and try to find their records. So it was an in thing, definitely at Harvard, but it was an entertaining show. Betsy Siggins, I think, was on a couple times. The Charles River Valley Boys became fixtures, and actually In 1960, they went into the studio there and put down 86 songs. It was their own little catalog of early bluegrass and string band songs, which we were really blessed to get the original tapes of and put in the the folk New England collection. Um, if I can just jump back to an earlier question, the Broadside folk music magazine, the Boston Broadside, which David Wilson was the editor of, that entire collection David has donated to Folk New England and is available at the UMass website. And anybody interested in that Bob Lurtzima show, Bob's show is always the inside front cover, full page ad. So you can get sort of a better picture of that through the Broadside. But yeah, Hillbilly at Harvard was a big deal, still is.
Right. So it's just about 6:30, so I want to be conscious of people's time. But I do want to say that Peter Drummy from MHS wrote in a comment, and he said, legend has it that Cambridge renumbered Palmer Street when Club 47 moved there, so it would still be at number 47. If so, it certainly speaks to a strong local influence. Even if it didn't happen as a teenager, we seem to have been magnetized by it, especially Harvard Square. And of course, it is actually true that it's 47 Palmer Street. I think it's probably the only number on Palmer Street. It's a very short street. There's certainly not 47 addresses.
So. Still sacred ground.
So I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And I also wanted to let people know that we can make copies of the book available. If you would like a signed copy, you can reach out to Olivia Sea at MHS, and there's her phone number, or you can just email us at programs@masshist.org, and we will take care of letting you know how much it costs and handling all of that. So Tom, I want to thank you for a great conversation, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving and a great holiday season.
Thank you, and same to you.
And good night to everyone else. And I hope that everyone else has a great Thanksgiving and holiday season as well.